Sometimes the loneliest rooms aren't empty because people left, they're empty because hope did. The 42nd floor of Brooks Global headquarters overlooked a city glowing beneath the soft shimmer of winter lights, where every street seemed to lead someone home except for one. Ethan Brooks sat alone at the far end of a polished walnut boardroom table built for 20 executives, yet every leather chair surrounding him remained perfectly still, their reflections stretching across the glossy surface like silent ghosts. Just an hour earlier, the room had echoed with presentations, quarterly forecasts, polite applause, and carefully rehearsed optimism. Now only the faint hum of the ventilation system and the distant buzz of elevators reminded him that the building was still alive. A catered dinner rested untouched beside him. The roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and warm rolls had long since cooled, the steam disappearing as quietly as another birthday no one remembered. His phone lit up every few minutes with automatic messages from business partners, board members, and networking contacts. Happy holidays. Congratulations on another successful year. Looking forward to working together. Hundreds of words, yet not one of them asked how he was doing. Ethan silenced the screen and leaned back, staring through the towering windows toward Chicago's skyline. Families gathered around glowing dining tables. Children laughed behind apartment windows. Couples hurried through snow-dusted sidewalks carrying shopping bags and cups of hot chocolate. The city seemed wrapped in warmth, but 42 floors above it all, success felt strangely cold. He had built one of the largest logistics companies in America, purchased homes he rarely visited, flown more private miles than commercial airlines recorded in a month, and shaken hands with governors, athletes, and celebrities. Yet none of those achievements could explain why he dreaded walking into his own penthouse every night. The silence always arrived before he did. He loosened his tie, closed the financial reports scattered across the table, and reached for his coat. It was nearly 9 o'clock. Even the cleaning crews had already finished their rounds. As he approached the boardroom door, something unusual interrupted the familiar stillness. A soft scraping sound drifted across the polished floor. Slow. Careful. Almost hesitant. Ethan froze. The sound came again. A tiny folded piece of paper slid beneath the narrow gap under the heavy oak door, moving inch by inch until it rested near his polished shoes. No footsteps followed. No knock. No voice. Only silence. He bent down, curiosity overcoming routine, and picked up the small square of cream-colored paper. The edges were uneven, as though cut by a child using classroom safety scissors. Across the front, written in careful blue crayon with slightly crooked letters, were just 9 simple words. If you're lonely too, you can share tomorrow with me. Ethan stared at the note without breathing. For reasons he could not explain, every number, every meeting, every carefully constructed wall inside him suddenly felt smaller than the quiet handwriting of someone he had never met. For several long moments, Ethan Brooks simply stood there, the folded note resting quietly in his hand as though it carried far more weight than a single sheet of paper ever should. He turned it over once, expecting another message, a signature, perhaps the name of someone from his staff playing an unusual holiday prank. There was nothing. Only the faint scent of crayons and fresh paper lingered beneath the sterile smell of polished wood and expensive leather. He looked toward the heavy boardroom door, pulled it open, and stepped into the empty executive hallway. The lights had already shifted into their nighttime setting, casting a warm amber glow across framed photographs of company milestones and decades of corporate success. Every office door stood closed. Every desk sat perfectly organized. The entire floor felt frozen in the quiet rhythm of a building that believed its workday had ended. Yet somewhere, only seconds earlier, someone had slipped that note beneath his door. Ethan glanced toward the security camera mounted above the hallway intersection. Without fully understanding why, he walked briskly toward the security office on the first floor. Instead of taking the elevator directly to the underground garage as he always did. Frank Morales, the evening security supervisor, looked up with surprise when the company chairman entered the room alone. Ethan managed a small smile before asking if he could review the hallway cameras from the executive floor. Frank immediately nodded and replayed the recording from several minutes earlier. At first, nothing unusual appeared. The hallway remained empty. Then, just before 8:53, a tiny figure stepped carefully into view. A little girl, no older than 7, wearing a faded blue winter coat that looked one size too large, walked slowly toward the boardroom door with both hands holding a folded piece of paper. Her blonde hair peeked from beneath a knitted white hat decorated with a small snowflake stitched near the brim. She looked left, then right. Not frightened, only careful, as though she hoped not to interrupt anyone. She knelt quietly, slid the note beneath the door, waited exactly 2 seconds with a hopeful smile, and then turned away before anyone could see her face clearly. She did not knock. She did not wait for thanks. She simply disappeared down the staircase instead of using the elevators. Ethan leaned closer to the monitor. "Can you rewind that?" he asked softly. Frank replayed the moment. Ethan left the security office with the folded note still tucked safely inside his coat, but instead of driving home, he found himself standing in the nearly empty lobby long after the revolving doors had stopped welcoming the evening rush. Outside, light snow drifted through the glow of the streetlights, settling gently across sidewalks where strangers hurried home carrying grocery bags, wrapped presents, and cups of warm coffee. Every few minutes the front doors opened, letting in another breath of icy Chicago air before closing again. He looked toward the marble staircase shown in the security recording. Something told him she preferred those stairs for a reason. Rather than returning to his car, Ethan quietly climbed down one flight at a time, passing silent conference rooms and darkened offices until he reached the lower level where a small community art display occupied a forgotten corner of the building. The lights were dimmer there, softer somehow. As he rounded the hallway, he noticed a maintenance worker smiling as he unfolded a tiny handwritten note taped beside a drinking fountain. Farther ahead, an elderly janitor carefully slipped another colorful piece of paper into his shirt pocket before pushing his cleaning cart away with noticeably lighter steps. Ethan slowed. She had been here only minutes before him. The trail was invisible to most people, yet somehow impossible to ignore once he recognized it. Every note seemed to leave behind a little more warmth than the building itself could provide. He followed the quiet clues until he reached a side entrance that opened toward a small public courtyard beside the tower. Snow covered the empty benches in thin white blankets, and strings of holiday lights wrapped around bare trees shimmered against the dark sky. Near the fountain, he finally saw her. The little girl from the security camera stood on her tiptoes, stretching to slide another folded note beneath the strap of a lonely violin case resting beside an elderly street musician who had stepped inside a nearby coffee shop to warm his hands. She never looked around to see whether anyone noticed. She simply smiled to herself, adjusted the worn canvas bag hanging from her shoulder, and began walking away with small, unhurried steps. Ethan followed at a respectful distance until she paused beside a city bus stop where a woman sat alone studying a hospital appointment card. The little girl quietly placed another note on the bench, then continued down the sidewalk before the woman even realized it was there. Ethan watched the woman discover the message moments later. Her tired expression softened into a gentle smile, and she pressed the tiny paper against her heart before carefully placing it inside her purse. Only then did Ethan understand. The child was not searching for people who looked poor or successful. She was searching for people who looked lonely. He continued after her through 2 more blocks until she stopped outside a modest neighborhood bakery preparing to close for the evening. An older woman stepped outside wearing a flour-dusted apron, smiled the moment she saw the little girl, and opened her arms without hesitation. The child hurried forward, hugged her tightly, and laughed with the pure relief of someone who had finally reached home. The woman brushed a few snowflakes from the little girl's blonde hair before handing her a small paper box tied with red string. As they disappeared together through the bakery door, Ethan remained across the street, quietly reading the note still resting inside his pocket. Somehow, 9 simple words written in blue crayon had led him farther than years of success ever had, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, tomorrow felt like something worth waiting for. Here is the next part in the requested format. Edit. The following afternoon arrived wrapped in pale winter sunlight that spilled across Chicago's streets like quiet hope after a long night. Ethan Brooks found himself standing outside the same neighborhood bakery long before he normally would have left his office. He had canceled 2 meetings without explanation, surprising an assistant who had never known him to rearrange his schedule for anything unrelated to business. Yet every few minutes his hand drifted toward the folded note resting safely inside his coat pocket, as though he needed to remind himself it had truly happened. Through the bakery window he watched customers come and go carrying fresh bread, cinnamon rolls, and warm smiles. Then the familiar little girl appeared behind the glass, carefully placing cookies into paper bags beside the older woman from the night before. She wore the same blue coat hanging neatly on a chair nearby, and every few moments she laughed at something the woman whispered while dusting flour from the counter. Ethan waited until the afternoon rush faded before quietly stepping inside. A small bell chimed above the door. The warm scent of butter, vanilla, and fresh bread replaced the icy air outside. The little girl looked up immediately, recognizing him without surprise, almost as though she had expected him to arrive someday. She smiled first. "Hello, Mr. Boardroom," she said with complete confidence. Ethan blinked before laughing softly. "You know who I am?" She nodded. "I saw your picture downstairs by the..." Over the next several days, Ethan found reasons to pass by Margaret's bakery that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with curiosity. He never announced his visits, and Charlotte never seemed surprised to see him. It became an unspoken rhythm. Sometimes he arrived before sunrise, when the windows glowed softly against the cold morning and Margaret was pulling fresh loaves from the oven. Other afternoons he stopped by after meetings, exchanging tailored suits in conference rooms for the comforting scent of cinnamon, warm bread, and quiet conversation. Charlotte was almost always sitting at a small wooden table near the back, surrounded by colored pencils, scraps of recycled paper, and a pair of well-worn safety scissors. She worked carefully, writing every note by hand, decorating each one with tiny stars, smiling suns, or little blue birds. One afternoon Ethan noticed that none of the paper matched. Some pieces came from the blank backs of old calendars. Others had once been grocery advertisements or bakery supply invoices. Even the crayons were worn nearly to the paper wrappers. "Do you ever buy new supplies?" he asked gently. Charlotte smiled without looking up from her work. "These still have colors left." Margaret placed 3 mugs of hot cocoa on the table before quietly sitting beside them. She looked at Ethan with the kind of expression that carried both gratitude and honesty. "Charlotte has never liked wasting anything," she said. "She says kindness does not have to be expensive." Ethan watched the little girl carefully fold another note before slipping it into the canvas bag. "Who taught you to do all of this?" he asked. Charlotte paused for the first time that afternoon. Her bright blue eyes drifted toward a framed photograph resting on a nearby shelf. It showed a smiling young woman with blonde hair standing between Charlotte and Margaret outside the bakery years earlier. A red ribbon decorated the frame. Charlotte climbed down from her chair, carried the picture back to the table, and held it gently with both hands. "My Mommy," she answered softly. "She used to leave little notes in my lunchbox before school. Even on hard days she always said that one kind sentence could stay with somebody longer than one bad day." Ethan listened without interrupting. Charlotte traced the edge of the photograph with one finger. "When Mommy became very sick, she could not leave the house anymore. But she still wrote notes for the nurses, the mail carrier, and people she never even met." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her granddaughter's hand. Before she passed away, Margaret said quietly, she asked Charlotte to keep spreading them whenever she thought someone needed hope. Charlotte nodded with a gentle smile that carried both sadness and determination. I promised I would not stop just because she was not here anymore. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the colorful notes scattered across the table. Suddenly they no longer looked like simple pieces of paper. They looked like promises traveling from one heart to another. As Charlotte slipped another folded message into her bag, Ethan noticed the nearly empty crayon box beside her. Only one blue crayon remained long enough to write clearly, yet she smiled as though it was more than enough. In that quiet little bakery, surrounded by reused paper, fading crayons, and memories lovingly preserved, Ethan realized he had spent years measuring wealth in numbers while a little girl measured it in encouragement, one handwritten note at a time. Winter settled comfortably over Chicago, and without realizing it, Ethan Brooks found that his calendar had begun changing in ways no executive report could explain. Meetings still filled his mornings, contracts still demanded signatures, and conference calls still echoed through polished offices, yet every evening seemed to guide him back to Margaret's bakery. His assistant quietly noticed that he no longer stayed inside the boardroom until midnight. Employees noticed something else as well. Their chairman had begun asking questions he had never asked before. He remembered birthdays. He stopped to thank custodians by name. He lingered in the lobby to greet receptionists heading home after long shifts. Even Frank Morales in security smiled one evening and joked, "Whoever wrote that little note deserves a promotion." Ethan only smiled in return, slipping the familiar blue crayon message back into the inside pocket of his coat where it had become a daily reminder of the person he wanted to become. One Saturday morning Charlotte invited him to help deliver her notes instead of simply hearing stories about them. They walked through quiet neighborhoods carrying her worn canvas bag, now noticeably lighter than before because most of the notes had already found new homes. Their first stop was a small nursing home where Charlotte greeted residents as though they were lifelong friends. She tucked colorful messages inside library books, beside knitting baskets, and near windows overlooking the snowy courtyard. An elderly gentleman with silver hair unfolded one note with trembling hands and smiled so brightly that Ethan instinctively smiled back. They continued to the public library, where Charlotte carefully slipped another message inside a returned novel before whispering, "Somebody might need this more than the story." At a nearby bus stop she left one beneath the bench where commuters often waited alone during cold mornings. She never stayed to watch anyone discover them. "Do you not want to see their faces?" Ethan finally asked as they continued walking beneath strings of holiday lights stretching across the avenue. Charlotte looked up with thoughtful blue eyes. "If I wait for people to say thank you, then the note becomes about me." She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag before continuing. "Mommy said kindness grows better when nobody feels they owe you anything." Ethan let those words settle quietly inside him. They reached a neighborhood park where children laughed while building snowmen beside parents wrapped in thick winter coats. Charlotte paused near an empty bench overlooking the frozen pond. She reached into her bag, then suddenly frowned. Instead of another folded note, she pulled out only a few tiny scraps of colored paper and the short blue crayon that had grown even smaller since Ethan first noticed it. She turned the crayon over in her fingers and laughed softly. "I guess it finally became too little." Ethan watched as she carefully tried writing anyway, but the crayon slipped from her hand and rolled beneath the bench. She bent down, retrieved it with a cheerful smile, and placed it back into the box as though it were still something precious. There was not a trace of disappointment on her face. She simply folded the blank paper and placed it back inside the bag. "I will make more when we have paper again," she said matter-of-factly. Ethan looked at the nearly empty bag, the tiny crayon, and the recycled scraps she treasured so carefully. In that quiet moment he realized the world had been changed by hundreds of handwritten notes created from almost nothing at all, and he silently made a promise to himself that Charlotte would never have to wonder where the next piece of paper or the next blue crayon would come from, even though he knew she would never be the one to ask. The following week, Ethan noticed something that immediately felt different. Every afternoon when he stopped by Margaret's bakery, Charlotte usually greeted him with the same bright smile that seemed capable of warming an entire room before a single loaf of bread came out of the oven. But this time her little wooden table stood empty. The familiar canvas bag rested neatly on the chair beside it, yet there were no scattered crayons, no folded notes, and no gentle humming drifting through the bakery. Margaret was arranging fresh bread behind the counter, though the smile she offered carried a quiet weariness Ethan had not seen before. "Where is Charlotte?" he asked softly. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before answering. "She is upstairs resting. She caught a cold a few days ago. Nothing serious, but I insisted she slow down for once." Ethan nodded with relief, but before he could respond, he noticed several unopened envelopes beside the cash register. Each one contained a colorful handwritten note, carefully folded exactly the way Charlotte always made them. "She still wanted people to have these," Margaret explained. "She said lonely people should not have to wait just because she needs a little rest." Ethan looked toward the staircase leading to the apartment above the bakery. Even while staying home, Charlotte had continued thinking about strangers she would probably never meet. Margaret gently lifted one envelope and smiled. "Would you do something for her?" Ethan accepted the small note without hesitation. "Of course. She wanted to deliver these herself, but perhaps today someone else can help." That afternoon became unlike any Ethan had experienced before. Instead of returning to the office, he carried Charlotte's notes across the city exactly as she had done so many times. One rested beside a library window where winter sunlight reached a quiet reading chair. Another slipped beneath a coffee cup left untouched by a man staring silently through the cafe window. One found its way onto the seat beside an elderly woman waiting alone at a neighborhood clinic. Ethan never waited to see their reactions. He simply kept walking, remembering Charlotte's words. "Kindness grows better when nobody feels they owe you anything." Yet despite his best effort to imitate her quiet generosity, he realized something was missing. Every note still carried Charlotte's gentle handwriting, tiny blue birds, little stars, and cheerful smiles. The warmth belonged to her, not to the paper. As evening settled over Chicago, Ethan returned to the bakery carrying the now empty canvas bag. Margaret smiled gratefully before inviting him upstairs for a cup of tea. Charlotte sat wrapped in a soft knitted blanket beside the apartment window overlooking the snow-covered street. Colored paper covered the coffee table despite Margaret's instructions to rest. Charlotte looked up with unmistakable excitement. "Did you remember the bus stop?" she asked before even saying hello. Ethan laughed quietly. "I did." "And the library?" "Yes." "Did you leave one near the hospital waiting room too?" Ethan nodded again. Charlotte leaned back against her blanket with a satisfied smile that seemed much bigger than the tiny apartment itself. "Good," she whispered. "Nobody should have to feel forgotten today." Ethan watched the little girl reach for her nearly empty box of crayons. Only the tiny blue crayon remained. She picked it up carefully and began writing another note, pressing gently so it would last just a little longer. In that peaceful room, Ethan suddenly understood that Charlotte had never been trying to change the whole world all at once. She simply refused to let one lonely day become two for someone else, and somehow that small promise had already begun changing his own life far more than she could possibly imagine. By the time spring quietly replaced the last traces of winter, something remarkable had begun unfolding inside Brooks' global headquarters. Employees who once hurried silently through the marble lobby now paused beside a simple wooden display that had appeared near the entrance. At its center rested a handwritten sign that read, "Take one if you need hope. Leave one if you can share it." Beneath the sign stood hundreds of colorful cards, fresh pencils, and neatly stacked paper waiting for anyone who wished to write an encouraging message for a stranger. No company logo appeared anywhere. No announcement celebrated the project. It simply existed, growing a little larger each day. Ethan visited the display every morning before entering his office. Some notes came from interns worried about their first jobs. Others came from executives thanking anonymous coworkers for unexpected kindness. Security officers, receptionists, delivery drivers, accountants, and visitors all added their own words until the basket needed to be refilled several times a day. Across the city, libraries, hospitals, nursing homes, bus stations, and community centers quietly received identical wooden displays, each one stocked with paper, colored pencils, and handwritten encouragement ready to travel from one heart to another. Ethan had arranged every detail carefully, asking only that no one attach his name to the project. Whenever someone asked who started it, the answer remained the same. A little girl reminded someone that nobody should feel forgotten. Charlotte knew nothing about any of it. She simply continued writing notes at the little table inside the bakery, believing the world still depended upon one message at a time. One sunny Saturday morning, Margaret closed the bakery early and invited Charlotte to accompany her to a neighborhood community celebration honoring volunteers. Charlotte wore her favorite blue coat even though the weather had finally turned warm enough to leave it behind. Tucked inside her familiar canvas bag rested another stack of carefully folded notes, along with a brand new box of crayons someone had anonymously left outside the bakery door a few weeks earlier. She had smiled with delight but never questioned where they came from. As they entered the community center, Charlotte stopped walking altogether. Along every wall stood large bulletin boards completely covered with colorful handwritten messages. Children laughed while decorating fresh cards with stars, hearts, blue birds, and cheerful drawings that looked strangely familiar. Elderly neighbors exchanged notes over coffee. Teenagers helped younger children write encouraging words. Volunteers carried baskets overflowing with folded messages destined for hospitals and shelters throughout the city. Charlotte slowly turned in every direction, her blue eyes growing wider with wonder. "Grandma," she whispered, "they are making notes." Margaret squeezed her hand gently but said nothing. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the small stage and invited one final guest forward. Ethan walked to the microphone carrying a simple wooden frame. Inside it rested a single piece of cream-colored paper with slightly uneven edges and 9 carefully written words in blue crayon. He looked directly at Charlotte before speaking softly. "Several months ago, someone reminded me that tomorrow could be shared. I believed I had built successful companies, but I had forgotten how to build hope. One little note changed that forever." Charlotte recognized the paper instantly. Her small hand slowly covered her mouth as tears of quiet joy filled her eyes. She had never imagined that the first note she slipped beneath a lonely door would someday open thousands of hearts instead. The applause faded, but the feeling inside the room lingered long after the final words had been spoken. Charlotte stood quietly beside Margaret, still looking at the framed note as though she could hardly believe that a few lines written with a fading blue crayon had traveled so much farther than she ever imagined. Ethan stepped down from the stage and walked toward her, holding the frame with both hands before carefully placing it in hers. "It belongs to you," he said with a warm smile. Charlotte looked up and gently shook her head. "No," she answered softly. "It belongs to everyone who needed it." Ethan felt his throat tighten. For a moment neither of them spoke. They simply smiled at one another while people around them continued writing colorful messages, laughing with strangers who no longer felt quite so alone. Weeks turned into months, and the simple movement that began with one folded note continued growing across Chicago. Schools invited children to create encouragement walls. Hospitals placed baskets of handwritten messages inside waiting rooms. Libraries tucked cheerful notes into returned books. Senior centers organized afternoons where neighbors wrote letters to people they had never met. Every project followed the same quiet principle. No signatures. No recognition. Just kindness freely given. Brooks' global headquarters changed as well. The enormous boardroom that had once echoed only with financial presentations and difficult negotiations became the home of a monthly community dinner. Employees volunteered alongside local families, retirees, teachers, students, and veterans. Long wooden tables replaced formal seating charts. Fresh bread from Margaret's bakery filled the room with familiar warmth, and laughter reached corners that had once known only silence. On the wall nearest the windows, inside a simple wooden frame, hung the original blue crayon note that had changed everything. Visitors often stopped to read it before taking their seats. Few realized they were looking at the beginning of an entirely different kind of success story. One bright Saturday afternoon, after another community dinner had ended, Ethan and Charlotte stood together near the windows overlooking the city. Summer sunlight reflected from the river while children played in the park several stories below. Charlotte leaned against the glass and smiled. "Do you still eat alone?" she asked with the same gentle honesty she had always carried. Ethan looked across the room where Margaret was laughing with employees, where Frank from security was teaching children how to fold paper airplanes, and where volunteers packed boxes filled with colorful notes for hospitals across the city. He slowly shook his head. "Not anymore," he answered. "You did not just help me find people to eat with. You helped me remember how to belong." Charlotte reached into her canvas bag, now filled with fresh paper and bright new crayons, and handed Ethan one last folded note. He opened it carefully. Inside, written in careful blue letters beside a tiny drawing of a bird, were the words, "The happiest hearts are the ones that always leave room for someone else." Ethan smiled, folded the note, and placed it beside the first one inside his jacket pocket. One had opened a lonely door. The other reminded him to keep it open forever. And as evening sunlight filled the room that had once been defined by silence, it became clear that true wealth had never been measured by buildings, boardrooms, or balance sheets. It had always been measured by the quiet courage to notice another lonely heart, to offer kindness without expecting anything in return, and to believe that even the smallest handwritten note could guide someone all the way home.